In 1932, about a year before Hitler was elected as Vice Chancellor, the Nazi Party won the election and the aging von Hindenburg, a First World War hero, had no choice but to turn over the leadership to him. Despite Hitler's resounding victory, many people felt it was a passing phase. They believed that the German people were not going to accept a madman like Hitler as their leader. After all, Germany, a cultured country, had given the world Mozart, Beethoven, Goethe, and Schiller, to name a few. They thought it would blow over, but Germany, still in the throes of the Depression, was desperate for change. Hitler promised that he would lead them into prosperity. In a frenzy and pounding on the podium, he announced to the crowd, "The first thing we must do is make Germany Judenrein, clean of Jews." Carried away by Hitler's conviction, the German people hailed him as their new Führer. However, the German Jews did not believe that Hitler was referring to them when he said, "We must make Germany Judenrein." He does not mean us, since they were native-born Germans, but rather the Ostjuden. Shortly after Der Stürmer, an official propagandist weekly started an aggressive campaign to demonize the Jews. They were depicted in comic strips as cheats and money grubbers with thick lips and big noses. Those malicious cartoons were conspicuously mounted in sealed glass cases on the outside walls of buildings all over Berlin. Overnight, our neighbors began to resent us and treat us disdainfully. Some of the children living on our street made fun of and insulted me. One boy in particular took delight in repeatedly calling me a dreckiger Jude, a dirty Jew. After a while, tired of being insulted, I warned him that the next time you call me a dirty Jew, I'm going to let you have it. He laughed it off. Yeah. Yes, and what are you going to do about it? You just wait and see, I said, walking away. A few days later, on the way back from our store to the apartment, the same boy and two of his friends blocked my way as I was trying to pass them. He sneered at me again, calling me a dirty Jew. Infuriated, I could not restrain myself any longer. Without warning, I pounced on him like a wildcat, grabbed his shirt and punched him in the face with such fury that I knocked out one of his teeth. He was so stunned that he did not even attempt to hit me back. His friends just stood there in shock, watching this little 8-year-old girl beat up their much taller friend. When the boy realized he was bleeding, he ran home crying, and his friends left. Out of breath, but pleased that I had retaliated, I ran back to our store and told my mother what had happened. She told me to go to the store's back room and stay there, afraid the boy's parents might come looking for me. Within minutes, the boy's father rushed into the store yelling, "Where is that brat?" She knocked my son's tooth out. Our tailor, Mr. Szymanski, who was doing alterations in the back, heard the commotion and came out holding a large pair of scissors and threatened the boy's father. "If you don't leave immediately, I'm calling the police." Intimidated, Herr Dümmel backed out of the store, mumbling that he would get me another time. From my hiding place, I overheard what happened and breathed a sigh of relief when the man left. For the next few days, I stayed out of sight and someone accompanied me whenever I left the house. Word must have gotten around, because I was never called a dirty Jew again. The next morning, September 1st, 1939, Hitler's army marched into Poland. We watched them from our window when they marched into Krakow. As the jeeps and tanks rolled by, we noticed that some people waved to the German soldiers, while others stood subdued on the sidewalk, wondering about the fate awaiting them. Shortly after the invasion, rumors of atrocities began to circulate. Jews were rounded up, arrested at random, and sent to work camps, and their families never saw or heard from them again. Those who resisted arrest were shot without mercy. To make things worse, the local Christian population cooperated with the Nazis, showing them the houses where Jews were living. All the Jews in Krakow were issued yellow armbands featuring a blue Star of David, and also yellow stars to be sewn onto their coats. We decided not to wear them, since this would make us easy targets. Fortunately, we lived in a section of Krakow with not many Jews, and therefore we were not likely to be stopped. We stayed in our apartment where we felt safe, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. We still listened to our shortwave radio, our only contact with the outside world. One day, my mother, my brother, and I were in the apartment. My father was not at home. I have no clear recollection of where he was. We heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs and listened with apprehension, hoping they would pass our door. But the footsteps grew louder and closer. We held our breath and realized to our horror that they had stopped at our door. There was a brief moment of silence, followed by violent pounding. "Open up! Open the door! Gestapo!" Frightened, we stood in the doorway of our room as Milcha, a young woman from one of the other families in the apartment, opened the door. A young man in uniform came in holding a piece of paper. An older Gestapo followed closely behind. "Heil Hitler," the first one said, extending his arm in salute and clicking his heels. "We have a report that one of you in this apartment has a shortwave radio. Which one of you is Bienenfeld?" "Here," my mother answered. We walked into our room with them, and they closed the door. The older man searched the room and quickly found the radio, which was in plain sight. We watched anxiously to see what was going to happen next. At 14, I was unaware of how serious the situation was. After all, I thought, it's not a crime to own a radio. I glanced at my mother and was surprised to see that she looked frightened. A deathly silence filled the room. The young SS man started pacing back and forth, somewhat ill at ease, and took off his gloves. Without looking at us, he finally said, "Your kind has taught us how to look for hidden gold. Undress," he ordered, pointing at my mother. "You too," he said, lifting his chin in my direction. "Machen Sie schnell. Make it quick." The officer had now stopped pacing and stood before us, legs astride, hitting his gloves impatiently against his hand. His partner put his revolver on the table and sat down. I looked at my mother and could not believe that she had actually started undressing. Outraged and embarrassed by the orders, my heart began to pound. I felt my face flush in anger. For a moment, I forgot who and where I was. I faced the two Nazis and, with measured breath, said in perfect German, "How dare you humiliate innocent people this way? In Germany you were always models of good manners, and now you come here and do this? Shame on you," I shouted, shaking in rage. My words echoed in the silence that followed. My mother gasped, "Fanny," staring at me in disbelief. My brother looked at me as if I had gone mad, but no one said a word. Looks of surprise were clearly written on the two men's faces. "Ziehen Sie sich an. Get dressed," I heard the young officer say quietly to my mother. Without another word, one of them picked up the radio, the other his revolver, and they left. We listened to the retreating footsteps. No one moved, and for a moment it seemed as if the world was standing still. After the Gestapo left, the families who were sharing the apartment with us told us that they had braced themselves to hear a gunshot from our room, but they never did. After the Gestapo searched our apartment, we lived in constant fear of hearing that dreadful pounding on our door again. There was no doubt in our minds that the Polish landlord who had evicted us from our previous apartment had reported us to them. Because of the arrests in the streets every day, my father and brother were now confined indoors. Without our shortwave radio, he felt isolated and shut off from the outside world. A determined woman, my mother gathered as much information as she could about the possibility of escape. Almost every day, she would go out in the streets of Krakow to see if there was anything to learn. One day, as my mother approached the center of town, she saw that the streets were full of soldiers and officers standing in groups, laughing and talking. My mother was not afraid of the Germans. She had business dealings with them on a daily basis. Unfazed by the scene, she walked to the crowd when suddenly she heard someone call her. Surprised, she turned around to see who it was and recognized a former customer from our store in Berlin, now dressed in uniform. Surprised to see her, the officer said, "Frau Bienenfeld, what on earth are you doing in Poland?" Taken back at being recognized, my mother did not know how to respond, but relaxed when she saw how friendly and genuinely interested the officer was. Encouraged by his sincerity, my mother told him about our situation. "We had to return to Poland," she explained, "and are waiting for our visas to immigrate to the USA. Unfortunately, the Polish quota is very high, and there's nothing we can do except wait." The officer listened with interest and then asked my mother in which district of Krakow she lived. When she told him, he smiled and said, "Sie haben aber Glück, you have luck. A good friend of mine is a colonel at the Gestapo headquarters. He is in charge of your district, and I think he will be able to help you. Here is his name and address," he said, writing out the information on a piece of paper. "Go see my friend and tell him I sent you." My mother stared at the paper he had handed her and almost forgot to thank him. Then she heard him say, "Viel Glück, good luck," as he waved goodbye. When my mother recovered from what had just taken place, she could not wait to get home to tell us her incredible news. She was totally out of breath when she came in and had to sit in a chair to calm herself down. After regaining her composure, she told us about the unbelievable coincidence of meeting a former customer from our store who had recognized her on the street and had actually offered to help us. After listening to the whole story, we came to the conclusion that it must have been the hand of God that led my mother to the street. Later that day, we all sat together to discuss how my mother should present our situation to the colonel, and realized that there was no way to prepare for such a meeting. My mother had one advantage in her favor. She spoke German fluently, without a trace of an accent, which was very unusual for someone born in Poland. The morning that she was going to meet the colonel, my mother took great care in selecting her clothes. It was important to make a good impression. When she was dressed and ready to leave, we wished her good luck and agreed that she looked elegant. It was only a short walk from our apartment to the Nazi headquarters. As my mother approached the building and saw the red Nazi flag with their threatening black swastikas, her heart skipped a beat. Realizing the enormity of what she was about to do, she took a deep breath and said a prayer before knocking at the colonel's door. An orderly looked surprised to see a woman asking to see his superior. He respectfully led her to the colonel's office and after knocking announced her presence. "Hi, Littler, Frau Bienfeld is here to see you," he said, and then closed the door behind him. The colonel rose from behind his desk and graciously asked my mother to sit down, curious to hear what had brought her to see him. Somewhat nervous, my mother started to tell the colonel about meeting his friend, who had suggested that she come to see him. "We are about to leave for the USA," she explained, "and all our papers are ready. Unfortunately, we have to wait for our number to come up, and there's no way of telling how long that will take. We arrived from Berlin only a few weeks ago and are now stranded here in Poland. You see," she added uneasily, "I am married to a Jewish man and have 2 children. Do you think you can help us?" she asked, looking hopefully at the colonel, then lost her courage and started to cry. The colonel listened carefully and seemed surprisingly sympathetic. He was sitting at his desk deliberating, while my mother dabbed at a tear-stained face. A few minutes later, he got up and, as if he had just remembered something, said, "There are still some consulates open in Warsaw. I'm going to give you a travel permit. Leave for Warsaw as soon as you can. Take your passports with you and buy visas from any consulate outside Europe willing to sell them to you. Once the visas are stamped in your passport, you will be able to get transit visas to Italy." He then walked back to his desk, wrote something on a piece of paper, stamped it, and handed it to my mother. He then wished her good luck and led her to the door. When she got outside, my mother breathed a deep sigh of relief. The Nazi flags no longer looked intimidating. The travel permit she now held in her hand could be our passport to freedom. The next morning, my mother set out to follow the colonel's instructions. This time she got dressed like a peasant woman to blend in with the passengers on the train. She bought her ticket without any difficulty and boarded her train to Warsaw. However, it did not leave the station until a German soldier checked each compartment to see if there were any Jews aboard. He walked to the train shouting, "Alle Juden heraus," as he opened and closed the door of each compartment. My mother's heart was pounding, even though she held the permit in her hand, and only after the soldier had checked and returned it to her was she able to relax. When she arrived in Warsaw, she found several consulates still open. She decided to get visas to Honduras, since it was the closest country to the USA. Once the visas were stamped at our passport, there was no reason to delay her return, and my mother boarded the next train back to Krakow. The trip was uneventful, and my mother had a chance to relax and go over the events of the last few days. Everything happened so fast. She had been pleasantly surprised at the colonel's willingness to help her. Although he had not asked about her status, he probably assumed that my mother was an Aryan married to a Jew and felt sorry for her. Soon after she returned, the transit visas to Italy were stamped into our passport, and there was no longer any reason to delay the departure. We started packing and hoped to be out of Poland within a few days.